June 7th, 1944. A day etched into history, forever marked by the thunderous roar of battle and the clash of empires. But on that fateful day, amidst the chaos and carnage of the Normandy landings, a different kind of war was being waged. A war not of bullets and bombs alone, but of factories, logistics, and an entirely new philosophy of combat. It was a war epitomized by a humble, unassuming vehicle, one that would become an icon of American ingenuity and a harbinger of a new industrial age of conflict. The Jeep. Imagine, if you will, the scene. The air is thick with the smell of salt and smoke, the distant rumble of artillery a constant companion. High above, the vast expanse of the European sky is a canvas for conflict, yet down on the ground, a different kind of drama unfolds. Oberleutnant Klaus Müller, a seasoned officer of the German 709th Infantry Division, stands near Sainte-Mère-Église, his eyes scanning the horizon. He's seen a lot in his years of service. The swift sweep into Poland, the seemingly unstoppable advance through France, the grinding attrition on the Eastern Front. He thought he understood the mechanics of modern warfare, the rhythm of mechanized divisions, the brutal calculus of supply and demand. But what he saw now, streaming inland from Utah Beach, defied all logic, all experience, all comprehension. A column of vehicles, not just a few, not a dozen, but an endless, relentless torrent. 117 identical military reconnaissance cars, Klaus counted in the span of just 2 hours. Each one pristine, as if it had just rolled off a factory floor moments ago. They moved with an almost arrogant efficiency, churning up the Norman earth as they advanced. A metallic river flowing into the heart of occupied France. Disbelief warred with a creeping dread in Müller's gut. This wasn't just an invasion force. It was something profoundly alien, something he couldn't quite grasp with his traditional German military training. What Müller and countless other Wehrmacht officers witnessed that morning wasn't merely a tactical thrust or a strategic landing. It was nothing less than an industrial phenomenon, a paradigm shift so profound it would shatter every assumption they held about the very nature of warfare. These vehicles, which the Americans called Jeeps, a corruption of their official designation, GP for general purpose, or perhaps just a colloquialism for the sheer versatility of their use, weren't just transport. They were the visible manifestation of a truth more devastating than any artillery barrage, more terrifying than any tank division. Germany, the industrial powerhouse of Europe, the nation that prided itself on precision engineering and military might, was not fighting an army. It was fighting an entire industrial system, one that had transformed warfare itself into a relentless process of mass production. Let's pause here for a moment and consider the psychological impact of such a sight. For years, German propaganda had painted the Americans as soft, decadent, and unprepared for the rigors of modern combat. They were portrayed as an effete democracy, too comfortable to fight, too concerned with consumer goods to produce effective war machines. Yet here, before their very eyes, was undeniable evidence to the contrary. An endless stream of identical, robust vehicles, each one a testament to an industrial capacity that literally defied German comprehension. It wasn't just intimidating, it was demoralizing. It wasn't just a threat, it was an existential challenge to their entire worldview. The journey of these Jeeps was itself an industrial marvel. They had begun arriving with the very first waves of landings, not as disassembled components requiring precious assembly time on the beachhead, but fully built and ready for action. Driven directly off the cavernous decks of landing ship tanks, or LSTs, Those ungainly, flat-bottomed vessels specifically designed to ferry men and machines directly onto enemy shores. They spilled onto the Norman coast in an unbroken procession. These LSTs, lumbering leviathans of logistics, crossed the English Channel in endless convoys, each ship capable of disgorging up to 30 fully assembled jeeps. Hundreds of these ships, like mechanical wombats, were delivering their metallic prochny to the waiting battlefields of France. The Channel, once a formidable natural barrier, had been transformed into an industrial conveyor belt, ferrying not just soldiers, but the very sinews of war. The jeeps bore the stark, functional markings of their origin. Either the Willys Overland Motor Company of Toledo, Ohio, or the Ford Motor Company of Dearborn, Michigan. Their official designation was prosaic: Truck 1/4 ton 4x4 Command Reconnaissance. But to the German soldiers who watched them pour onto French soil, mud splattering their pristine green paint, they represented something far more ominous than mere nomenclature. They were concrete, irrefutable evidence of an industrial capacity that defied all logic, all previous understanding, all comprehension. Imagine Hauptmann Vera Lindermann, commanding the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment. He was a meticulous officer, steeped in the traditions of the Wehrmacht, where every piece of equipment was precious, carefully maintained, and accounted for. In his after-action report, dated June 9, 1944, just days into the invasion, his words convey a mixture of astonishment and grim realization. He wrote, and I paraphrase, "The enemy possesses vehicles in quantities we reserve for ammunition rounds. Every American unit, down to the squad level, appears to have motorized transport." This wasn't hyperbole. This was a direct, chilling observation of a fundamental difference in strategic philosophy. Lindermann's report continued, starkly illustrating the German predicament. "We destroyed 12 of their reconnaissance cars yesterday. This morning I count 40 in the same sector. They treat complex military vehicles the way we treat rifle cartridges, as items to be used and discarded without thought." This wasn't just a complaint about enemy numbers. It was a profound cultural clash. For the Germans, a vehicle was an investment, a precious resource requiring skilled mechanics and careful preservation. For the Americans, as Lindermann correctly observed, it was a consumable, an expendable tool in the larger industrial war effort. The raw statistics of American Jeep production, had German military planners known them, would have truly stunned them into silence. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories churned out over 640,000 Jeeps. Let that number sink in for a moment. Almost 2/3 of a million. At their peak production, Willys Overland and Ford, often working in tandem, were completing one vehicle every 90 seconds on their assembly lines. Think about that pace. By the time you've read this sentence, another Jeep would have been ready for the war effort. This single vehicle type, this ubiquitous, unassuming little Jeep, represented a staggering 1/4 of all American military motor transport production during the entire war. Contrast this with Germany's own efforts. During the entirety of the war, the Germans, with all their engineering prowess and industrial might, managed to produce barely 50,000 Kübelwagens, their equivalent to the Jeep. That's a disparity of more than 12 to 1. The sheer scale of American output wasn't just a quantitative difference. It was a qualitative leap, a fundamental redefinition of industrial capacity directed towards total war. The Germans simply could not conceive of such numbers, such relentless output, such an overwhelming deluge of material. Their entire industrial ecosystem was geared towards quality, towards precision, towards meticulous engineering. The American approach was brute force applied with terrifying efficiency. What then made this production miracle possible? It wasn't just superior technology, although American industrial innovation played its part. It was primarily a revolutionary concept of standardization that exceeded anything in German military experience. Every single Jeep, whether it was built by Willys or by Ford, used completely interchangeable parts. This seemingly simple design decision had monumental consequences. A transmission from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willys MB in minutes. Wheels, engines, axles, and even minor components like spark plugs and fan belts were identical across all production runs, regardless of the originating factory. Imagine the implications of this. In the German military, a broken part often meant a specialized component, potentially sourced from a specific factory, requiring specific tools and highly trained mechanics. The complexity of their designs, while aiming for perfection, often created logistical nightmares. The Americans, however, embraced modularity. Their Jeeps were designed not just to be built fast, but to be repaired even faster by anyone, anywhere. This meant that the pool of available parts was effectively infinite, and the expertise required for basic repairs was minimal. Any soldier with a wrench and a replacement part could get a disabled Jeep back in action. This standardization extended beyond just the vehicle itself, permeating the entire supply system. Spare parts were not just available. They were pre-positioned based on statistical analysis of failure rates, ensuring that replacement components were always exactly where they needed to be, precisely when they were needed. It was a logistical dance orchestrated with breathtaking precision, a numbers game played on an epic scale. Feldwebel Hans Richter of the 716th Static Infantry Division, observing American operations from a concealed position near Carentan, recorded his bewilderment in his diary. "The Americans do not repair their vehicles," he wrote. "They simply replace broken parts with new ones from an endless supply. I watched a damaged vehicle restored to operation in less than an hour. The engine was not repaired, but replaced entirely, unbolted, and lifted out, with a fresh engine installed as casually as changing a tire." He paused, perhaps reflecting on his own unit's struggles, before adding, "Our mechanics would require a week to perform such an operation. The Americans did it in a field under sporadic artillery fire while smoking cigarettes." This observation cuts to the core of the cultural and philosophical divide. The German military mind, forged in a tradition of preserving and maintaining every piece of equipment, where resources were often scarce and meticulous care was paramount, struggled to comprehend the American approach. In the Wehrmacht, a vehicle was assigned to a unit and carefully tracked throughout its service life. Losing a vehicle through negligence was not just a setback, it was a court-martial offense. Mechanical problems were diagnosed with painstaking precision. Parts were carefully repaired or even manufactured on-site by skilled artisans if replacements were unavailable. The Kubelwagen, Germany's answer to the Jeep, a sturdy and reliable vehicle in its own right, nonetheless required factory-trained mechanics for any significant maintenance. It was a testament to craftsmanship, but a nightmare for wartime logistics. The Americans operated on entirely different principles, grounded in a cold, hard economic reality and a pragmatic understanding of industrial production. They had calculated that a Jeep's combat life expectancy was approximately 90 days, and they planned accordingly. Rather than investing in elaborate, fixed repair facilities that would be vulnerable to attack and slow down operations, they simply manufactured replacements in quantities that vastly exceeded any possible loss rate. When a Jeep was damaged beyond immediate, simple field repair, it wasn't a crisis. It was stripped of any immediately usable parts: tires, batteries, perhaps an intact engine, and abandoned. A new vehicle, fresh from the factory, would arrive within hours or days, delivered by the endless convoys that connected the beaches to the advancing front lines. It was a philosophy of abundance, a deliberate embrace of disposability. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schroeder, Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, captured the German bewilderment perfectly in a letter to his wife. "The Americans fight a rich man's war," he wrote, with a mix of awe and frustration. "They expend vehicles the way we expend ammunition. Yesterday, I observed a jeep strike a mine. The crew emerged unharmed, transferred their equipment to another vehicle that appeared within minutes, and continued their mission. The destroyed jeep was pushed to the roadside and forgotten. In our army, such a loss would require reports, investigations, and weeks of effort to obtain a replacement." This anecdote is incredibly telling. It highlights not just the material disparity, but the profound difference in organizational culture and bureaucratic processes. For the Germans, every loss was a bureaucratic burden, a drain on scarce resources and even scarcer manpower. For the Americans, it was a minor inconvenience, a mere blip in the relentless forward momentum of their industrial war machine. This was the true cost of their wastefulness, a cost that only an economic superpower could bear, and a form of strength that stunned their adversaries. By June 10th, just 4 days after D-Day, American forces had landed over 12,000 vehicles in Normandy, with jeeps comprising the largest single category. This wasn't just a military invasion. It was a logistical avalanche, burying German defenses under a tide of steel and gasoline. These vehicles transformed the battlefield in ways German doctrine simply had not anticipated. American reconnaissance units, mounted in agile jeeps, penetrated German lines with unprecedented speed and flexibility. They weren't tied to main roads, nor did they require the elaborate support of larger armored vehicles. They could dart through the Norman countryside, appearing and disappearing almost at will. Artillery forward observers, equipped with radios and mounted in jeeps, could rapidly relocate after calling in fire, making counter-battery fire by the Germans nearly impossible. By the time German artillery had zeroed in on their previous position, the jeeps were already miles away, spotting targets for a new barrage. Perhaps most critically, supply units, also heavily motorized with jeeps and larger trucks, maintained continuous contact with advancing forces, eliminating the pauses for consolidation that German commanders had expected to exploit. In traditional warfare, an advance often meant outrunning your supplies, necessitating a halt for replenishment. The Americans, with their ceaseless convoys and flexible jeep-based logistics, largely bypassed this friction. This denied the Germans precious time to regroup, reorganize, and counterattack. The battle was fought at the American tempo, a relentless, motorized pace. The jeep's individual capabilities further compounded German difficulties. With its robust four-wheel drive and relatively low weight, it could traverse terrain that German planners had considered impossible for vehicles. The Norman bocage country, with its sunken roads, dense hedgerows, and narrow tracks, should have been a German advantage. It was designed to channel American vehicles into predictable kill zones, to slow their advance, and to negate their mechanized superiority. Instead, jeeps simply drove through fields, over embankments, and around obstacles. They created their own road network, independent of the mapped routes German forces had meticulously prepared to defend. This ability to go almost anywhere, at speed, effectively nullified a significant portion of the German defensive strategy. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division, reflected on this after the war, his words tinged with a grudging admiration. "The Jeep gave every American unit the mobility we had achieved only with our elite mechanized forces," he wrote. "A single vehicle could carry a machine gun team, a mortar crew, communications equipment, or supplies. They appeared everywhere, in places we thought secure, bringing firepower or calling in artillery with their radios. We could not establish a continuous front because the Americans simply drove around our positions. This observation highlights a crucial point. The Jeep didn't just give the Americans mobility, it democratized it. Every platoon, every squad, could have its own transport, its own means of rapid maneuver and support. This meant that the Germans were not just fighting a few elite mechanized units. They were fighting an entire army that moved with the speed and flexibility of those elite forces. It was a tactical nightmare, a hydra-headed monster where cutting off one vehicle meant little, for another dozen were already flanking your position. The maintenance and supply systems supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming, a testament to American logistical genius. American logistics units had prepared for operations on an industrial scale, applying the same principles that built their civilian economy. Ships arrived daily, not just carrying fuel and ammunition, but entire vehicles, spare engines, transmissions, and pre-packaged component sets. It was a moving factory, extending across the Atlantic and onto the European continent. Mobile workshops, essentially repair facilities on wheels, advanced immediately behind combat units, capable of performing any repair or replacement needed right there in the field. The efficiency was breathtaking. If a unit lost 10 Jeeps in combat, 10 replacements would arrive within 48 hours, often less. Major Heinrich Zimmermann of the 12th SS Panzer Division, a unit renowned for its own logistical capabilities, observed this with a mixture of professional awe and bitter resignation. The American supply system operates like a factory production line extended to the battlefield, he wrote. Everything is standardized, packaged, and delivered on schedule. They have removed the friction from warfare that Clausewitz described. While we struggle to maintain our existing equipment, they simply order replacements as if from a catalog. Zimmermann's reference to Clausewitz is particularly poignant. Karl von Clausewitz, the great Prussian military theorist, famously described friction as the inherent difficulty, unpredictability, and chaos of war. The fog, the breakdowns, the delays that plague every military operation. The Americans, through their industrial might and logistical prowess, had found a way to minimize this friction to an unprecedented degree. They had industrialized away a fundamental aspect of warfare, replacing uncertainty with certainty, scarcity with abundance, and delay with speed. The psychological impact on German forces became evident within days of the invasion. For years, their leadership had propagated the myth that Americans were soft, decadent, and dependent on material comfort, incapable of enduring the harsh realities of combat. Yet, here they were, encountering an enemy who possessed material abundance beyond their wildest imagination. The sight of endless columns of identical Jeeps, each one new and fully equipped, was profoundly demoralizing for troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in service since the Polish campaign, 4 long years earlier. Their own vehicles were often a patchwork of repairs, worn from years of grinding conflict. The contrast was stark, brutal, and utterly disheartening. Gerfreiter Wolfgang Braun, a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, was tasked with examining captured Jeeps. His report was illuminating. Every component is designed for mass production and easy replacement, he noted. The engine is simple but adequate. The transmission is robust rather than refined. Nothing is polished or precisely fitted, yet everything functions reliably. They have sacrificed elegance for quantity, and quantity is winning the war. And this wasn't just an observation on engineering. It was a profound insight into the strategic choice made by the Americans. They understood that in a total war, overwhelming numbers often trumped individual perfection. Another deeply troubling aspect for German observers, indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, was the racial integration visible in American motor pools. African American soldiers drove jeeps, maintained them, and supervised motor pools. This challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness. Feldwebel Kurt Wagner noted with bewilderment, "Negro soldiers operate and repair these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. Our racial theories suggest this should be impossible, yet the evidence is undeniable." The very machinery of American war, in its raw, undeniable effectiveness, exposed the hollowness and brutality of Nazi racial dogma. American modifications to their jeeps further demonstrated a flexibility and ingenuity that German military culture, with its rigid adherence to doctrine and official designs, could not easily accommodate. Within days of landing, units were welding additional armor plate onto their jeeps for added protection against small arms fire and shrapnel. They installed crude but effective wire cutters on the front bumpers to counter German piano wire traps strung across roads. They mounted multiple machine guns, transforming reconnaissance vehicles into mobile firing platforms, and they adapted jeeps for a myriad of specialized roles on the fly. Medical units quickly converted jeeps into makeshift ambulances by installing simple stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with bulky radio equipment, creating mobile communication centers. Engineers mounted mine detectors, turning them into lead vehicles for route clearance. Each modification, though crude by German standards of aesthetic and engineering perfection, was immediately effective, born of necessity and battlefield pragmatism. The contrast with German equipment, which often came with highly specific operating parameters and little room for improvisation, became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed. The Wehrmacht's vehicles required specific fuel grades, specialized spare parts, and highly trained mechanics, a logistical burden in itself. Moreover, many German units, despite their reputation for mechanization, still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. A single German division could require thousands of horses, consuming tons of fodder daily. These horses were vulnerable to artillery, required constant care, and, most critically, limited mobility to a walking pace. Watching American units advance at 30 miles in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance was not just a military setback. It was deeply, profoundly demoralizing. It was like witnessing a glimpse into a future they were not prepared for, a future where speed and expendability ruled. By June 15th, barely a week after D-Day, German intelligence estimated that American forces in Normandy possessed over 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving daily. This number seemed impossible to officers who remembered the entire German army invading Poland in 1939 with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types combined. The mathematics of American production were staggering. Their calculations suggested that the United States could theoretically lose every single vehicle in Normandy, every truck, every tank, every jeep, and replace them all within just 2 weeks. Colonel Ernst Wagner of a Panzer division compiled a grim report that reached Field Marshal Rommel shortly before his injury. "We face an enemy," Wagner wrote, "who has industrialized warfare to a degree we never imagined possible. They mass-produce military vehicles with the same methods they produce civilian automobiles. Every American soldier seems to know how to drive and perform basic maintenance. Their entire society is mobilized for mechanical warfare in a way ours never achieved." This was the core of the unbridgeable disparity, the difference in production philosophy. German vehicles, like the Kübelwagen, were undeniably well-engineered, carefully constructed, and designed for longevity. They represented the pinnacle of German craftsmanship and attention to detail. But Germany, at its peak output, could produce only a few dozen such vehicles per day. American Jeeps, by contrast, were simple, crude by German standards of engineering elegance, but they rolled off assembly lines at rates Germany could not match even with all its factories combined. Where German industry sought perfection, American industry sought adequacy, multiplied by overwhelming numbers. It was a choice between bespoke tailoring and mass-produced ready-to-wear, and in the brutal arena of total war, mass production was proving to be the more potent weapon. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, provided perhaps the starkest and most prescient assessment of the situation. "We are fighting the last war," he declared, "while the Americans fight the next one. We perfect individual vehicles while they perfect the system that produces vehicles. We train specialist mechanics while they design vehicles any soldier can maintain. We are artisans fighting an assembly line, and the assembly line is winning." This quote encapsulates the entire conflict of philosophies. It wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a battle of industrial and organizational models. The American system's redundancy and sheer material abundance frustrated German tactical planning at every turn. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns, a classic tactic, proved futile when American engineers appeared with portable bridging equipment carried on jeeps, often having the crossing re-established within hours. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared almost immediately, continuing the mission without a missed beat. Mining roads only caused Americans to bypass them, simply driving through fields with their versatile jeeps. Every German tactical success, every localized victory, was negated by the overwhelming, almost casual American material abundance. It was like trying to drain an ocean with a bucket. The Jeep, in this context, became more than just a military function. It became a symbol of this very abundance that permeated the American war effort. German soldiers reported seeing Jeeps used for tasks that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht, where every resource was precious, and every vehicle had a strictly defined high-priority military role. They saw Jeeps delivering mail, transporting journalists, carrying chaplains to forward positions, even moving generals' personal baggage. This casual use of military equipment for convenience, rather than strict necessity, demonstrated a level of wealth that German soldiers, accustomed to scarcity and careful preservation, found both amazing and deeply demoralizing. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, in a letter to his family, eloquently captured this bewildering reality. "The Americans use their vehicles like we use bicycles," he wrote, "for everything and without concern for wear. I saw a Jeep being used to deliver hot food to a single outpost, a trip that wore the engine and consumed fuel for the comfort of 3 men. In our army, those men would walk and eat cold rations. This wastefulness should be a weakness, but when you can waste without consequence, it becomes a form of strength." Hoffmann's insight here is profound. What appears as wasteful from a perspective of scarcity transforms into a powerful strategic advantage when abundance is limitless. It's a complete inversion of conventional military thinking. The technological gap, too, appeared in unexpected ways that favored the Americans. American Jeeps came equipped with standardized toolkits, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper for field use, and spare parts packages carefully calculated by statistical analysis of previous campaigns. German vehicles, by contrast, often lacked even basic tools, relied on the hard-won experience and intuitive skill of their mechanics rather than documentation, and competed for scarce spare parts through a complex, bureaucratic requisition system that could take weeks or even months to yield results. This wasn't just a difference in engineering. It was a difference in how an entire industrial society organized itself to wage war. As June bled into July, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility. Their static, defensive positions, once thought impregnable, were outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units that appeared from unexpected directions. Artillery positions, painstakingly established and carefully camouflaged, were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry units. Supply lines, the very arteries of any army, were cut by fast-moving patrols that seemed to materialize behind German lines, strike with precision, and disappear before reserves could respond. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that relentlessly favored the side with unlimited motorized transport. The very terrain itself, once a German ally, was now a neutral canvas upon which the American war machine painted its swift, unstoppable movements. Major Wilhelm von Tauben, observing the American breakout preparations in late July, wrote a chilling assessment for his superiors. "They have achieved something we thought impossible," he noted. "The complete motorization of an army. Every soldier can be moved by vehicle. Every gun can be towed at highway speeds. Every supply item can be delivered directly to the consumer. We are fighting a 19th century war against a 20th century enemy." This wasn't just a lament. It was a stark recognition of the technological chasm that had opened up between the two forces. The German High Command's attempts to counter American motorization proved utterly futile. Orders to target vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were everywhere, dispersed and seemingly infinite. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every American unit possessed organic transportation, capable of sustaining itself for significant periods. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel, a constant German vulnerability, were negated by a supply system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany hadn't seen since the heady days of its 1940 blitzkrieg. By the time of Operation Cobra in late July, the decisive American breakout that shattered the German defenses in Normandy, American forces in the region possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with jeeps still comprising the single largest category. The German estimate, painstakingly compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance, suggested that the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses across the board and still remain more motorized than any single German division at full strength. This calculation, when reported to Berlin, was dismissed as defeatist, propaganda, or sheer exaggeration. It was, in fact, conservative. The influence of American motorization and its underlying industrial philosophy extended far beyond the immediate military impact of the Normandy campaign. German officers who survived the war, those who had witnessed this industrial spectacle firsthand, would carry these profound lessons into the arduous reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, of mass production, of designed simplicity, and of expendable efficiency would directly influence German industrial development in the coming decades. Consider the Volkswagen. The Kübelwagen, Germany's wartime equivalent, had failed to compete with the Jeep in the crucible of war, a testament to its artisanal production methods. Yet, the civilian Volkswagen Beetle, applying the very mass production principles the Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly on the battlefield, would go on to achieve astonishing success in peacetime, becoming a global symbol of affordable, reliable motoring. It was a direct, albeit ironic, legacy of the lessons learned in Normandy. Feldwebel Otto Schultz, who spent 3 grueling years as a prisoner of war in America, later reflected on his experiences with remarkable clarity. "In Normandy," he wrote, "we learned that modern war was not about courage or skill, but about industrial capacity. The Americans showed us that victory belonged to whoever could produce the most, ship the fastest, and replace losses immediately. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of a new kind of warfare we were not prepared to fight." The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents more than just a military mismatch or a tactical defeat. It was a collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, two distinct civilizational philosophies. The Germans, with their deeply ingrained tradition of professional military excellence, precision engineering, and meticulously maintained equipment, met an American military that had, perhaps unwittingly, transformed warfare into an exercise in industrial management and mass production on a scale never before conceived. In the end, the endless columns of jeeps that poured across Normandy represented something far more profound than mere military vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy, tangible proof that American industrial might could be projected across vast oceans and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. For the German soldiers watching those columns advance, each jeep was a messenger, bearing the same simple, brutal truth. The age of artisan warfare had ended, and the age of industrial warfare had not just begun, but had already reached a terrifying maturity. The final word, perhaps, belongs to Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, who observed American operations throughout the Normandy campaign, and remarkably, survived to become an automotive engineer in post-war Germany. His reflection carries the weight of a painful, yet ultimately transformative lesson. The Americans taught us, he wrote, that in modern war, the factory is more important than the battlefield. Their jeeps, arriving in endless numbers, each one identical and replaceable, showed us that warfare had become a branch of industry. We thought we were soldiers. They showed us we were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and their factory was infinitely larger and more efficient than ours. This profound insight, that the factory had become the true front line, resonates far beyond the fields of Normandy. It's a lesson that continues to shape modern military thought, emphasizing the critical importance of supply chains, industrial base, and technological adaptability. In an age of increasingly sophisticated weaponry, the temptation is always to focus on the individual quality of each piece of equipment. But the story of the Jeep in Normandy serves as a potent reminder that often the overwhelming quantity of good enough can utterly swamp the finely tuned precision of perfect, especially when backed by an industrial machine that treats the battlefield as merely another extension of its production line. What does this mean for us today? It means understanding that national power isn't just about military might. It's about the underlying industrial capacity and logistical networks that sustain that might. It means recognizing that the ability to innovate, adapt, and scale production rapidly is as crucial as any individual technological breakthrough. It means appreciating that resilience in a conflict, or any crisis for that matter, often comes from redundancy and the ability to replace losses quickly rather than simply preserving what you have. The Jeep, in its humble practicality, taught the world that the true measure of strength might not be in how perfectly you build something, but in how many you can build, how quickly you can deploy them, and how effortlessly you can replace them when they're gone. It was a brutal lesson, paid for in blood and shattered assumptions, but it was a lesson that fundamentally reshaped the course of history and the very nature of human conflict. The age of artisans was indeed over. The assembly line had truly won.